we've got a property, we've got a borrower, we'll put a sad face on him because he's motivated and in distress, and then we have the bank over here, which we can draw a little piggy. I think that's a piggy. Curly tail. Okay, so we have the seller who's the borrower, and we've got the house. Now the borrower signed a note to the bank, a promissory note, to purchase the property or to refinance the property. The bank has a lien against the property, a mortgage or a deed of trust, depending what state you're in. And the borrower has title, has the deed to the property in his name. So that's the way it looks before you come along. Now, if this borrower can't make the payments or isn't willing to or just can't afford to or is already starting to be in default, you come along, Mr. Happy Face, and you ask the borrower, who's the seller, to deed the property over to you. Okay? So now you are now the owner of that property the minute that's deeded over. Now some people have a struggle with that because they say, wait a minute, what about the mortgage on the property? Well, there's still a mortgage on the property. There's still a lien against it. It's just that this person no longer owns it. You own it. And there's still a lien. Now, what happens if you don't pay on the note, the payments? Well, the bank can foreclose against the property. The bank can also, if there's what's called a deficiency, meaning there's more owed than the foreclosure sale yields, go after the borrower because the borrower signed a note. But the bank can't sue you. So it's going to remain on the borrower's credit report, the seller, in this case, their credit report, and it's not going to be on yours. Okay? So you take the property subject to the existing mortgage lien, and you're going to make payments to the bank. Okay? We're not going to assume it. We're not going to ask for permission. We're just going to do it. Okay? Now, what are some of the advantages? Let's talk about the advantages of buying a property subject to an existing loan. Okay, advantage number one, no qualifying. Meaning you do not have to qualify for the loan. We're not going to ask the bank for permission, therefore we don't have to qualify for the loan. That means it's not on your credit report, and it's not something you have to produce a loan application and credit and proof of income and all those kinds of things. So that's good. Number two, small down. Typically we're looking for a seller who's got not a lot of equity and doesn't expect a whole lot of money. Usually they'll do it, if there's little or no equity, they'll do it for nothing. You might have to put up some money if they're behind in payments or give them some moving money, but not a substantial amount of money. Certainly not 20% down. Number three, a better interest rate. If you wanted to buy a property and borrow from an institutional lender, your rate, let's say, might be 5.5%. In the same scenario of the same property, if the person who's going to borrow against it is going to live there, they might get 4%. So an interest difference of 1.5%. And that's substantial. So if this person lived in the property and they got a 4% mortgage, which you can't get as an investor, you're getting a better interest rate than you could if you went to a bank. Okay? And number four, you get some pay down of the loan. So if this seller has been living there for 6 or 7 years, there's only 23, 24 years left on the mortgage. As you know, most mortgages that are 30 years, in the first 5 years, it's almost all interest payments, and then after that, you start knocking down principal. So you're shortening the length of the mortgage, and you're starting to pay down principal. You get over that hump of that first 5 years of all interest. And it's not on your credit report. which could be a good thing if you wanted to go, let's say, borrow for something else, like a car, or maybe to buy another house to live in. You don't have to report this as your personal obligation because, number one, we're not going to take title in our own name anyway. We're going to do it in a trust or an LLC, which we could have another discussion about in another video, but not in your own name. If you take it subject to in an entity, it's not on your credit report, and you don't assume the loan, it's not your personal obligation. So if you fill out a loan application for something else, you don't have to disclose that this loan exists because it's not your personal obligation. And for whatever crazy reason that this deal turns bad, which I'll talk about later what the right thing to do is, but let's say the market went bad, everything went bad, it's not going to affect your credit, because it's not on your credit report. Now, it'll affect the seller's credit, and he might be upset with you, but look at the alternative. Would you rather have the seller upset with you or Bank of America, who you signed on a loan personally, upset with you? You understand? So I wouldn't recommend you not make the payments if things go bad. I'll explain to you what the right thing to do is. But just, if everything hits the fan, it does protect you from personal obligation. Okay? So let's talk about an example deal. An example deal would look something like this. Let's say you have a property with an ARV, that's an after repaired value, of $100,000. Now, if you're in rural Oklahoma, just divide by 2. If you're in California, just multiply times 4. I use round numbers to make the math easy to follow. I understand in California a $100,000 house doesn't exist. But just follow me on the concept. Don't get wrapped up in the values that I'm talking about, okay? So let's say the seller owes $92,000. And let's say his principal, interest, taxes, and insurance, the PITI, is around, let's say, $700 per month. And that will vary depending on what your local property taxes are. In high property tax states, obviously that'll be higher, but generally rents are higher in those areas anyway, so it'll even out. But just follow me here. Okay, so if this seller was going to list the property with a real estate agent for $100,000, and in that price range would probably sell quickly, minus the broker fee, minus the closing costs, pay off the $92,000, what's the seller walking away from closing with? Nothing. I mean, he's breaking even. What if, typical scenario, seller had to move out of town for a new job? The broker said, hey, don't worry, we can close by mail. So the buyer, after 1, 2, 3, 4 months, the buyer of this property couldn't qualify for the loan, so they had to put it back on the market. Now this time, the seller says to the broker, listen, just drop the price a little bit because I got to move quickly because I can't make payments on this house anymore. I'm making payments on another house where I'm living now. So the problem with that is if you drop the price, not only is there not break even, the seller may have to come to closing with money because there's not enough after the broker's fee, closing costs, and paying off the loan. So the seller might get in a desperate situation. So he advertises it for rent, okay, for sale or rent on Craigslist. Very common scenario. And in the ad, it says something like, must be willing to show the house, it's also for sale. So no one wants to rent that house, and now he can't rent it, and he's having trouble selling it, and he can't make the payments. He's in big trouble. And now he becomes in default of the loan, okay? So let's say he has back payments with interest and penalties and everything of $2,000. So you could, at this point, say to the seller, look, if you go to foreclosure, your credit is destroyed. Your credit is already hurt now because you're late a few months. But maybe foreclosure hasn't started yet. What you do is you say, I'll give you the $2,000, not directly to him, but directly to his lender at closing, and I'm going to take the property subject to the $92,000 mortgage. Okay? So now you own the property, you're into it for a total of 92 plus 2, which is 94. It should be in fine condition. He just had it for sale, paint, carpet, and everything should be looking good. Now let's say that the market rent for this property is $1,100. And your payment is $700, so thus you're making $400 per month. In that case, you would be break even with $2,000 invested and $400 a month. You'd be break even in 5 months. After a year, you'll have doubled your money, and the property will probably appreciate. You get a mortgage interest deduction on it because even though you don't own it, you're making the payments. Even though you do own it and it's not your mortgage, you're paying on it, so you can deduct the mortgage interest as if you took out the mortgage. We'll explain that a little later why. But this is a pretty good deal. This is a bread and butter subject to deal that you should be willing to do all day long. Okay, let's talk about the one major thing that can go wrong. One of the things that can go wrong, which is not the major thing, but let's cover one thing first, is that the property can go down in value to the point where it's worth less than the mortgage balance. Now, if you're still making $400 a month, I wouldn't worry about it because eventually the loan will pay down and the values will come back up again. But if the rents get to the point where they're less than the PITI and you have negative equity, you might consider selling the property or just giving it back to the seller, which you have the right to do in the contract that we're going to go over later. But the big thing that a lot of people are worried about, which actually isn't that big of a deal, is what's called the due on sale clause. In every mortgage that's an institutional mortgage, there's a clause that says if you transfer property to a separate party, not to your spouse or your kids, but to a third party, the lender may, at its option, call all sums due and payable within 30 days. Let me say it again. The lender may, at its option, call all sums due and payable. That means it's not really due on sale automatically. The lender has the option to accelerate it, and in most cases, they don't. They don't. You make the payment and they take it. So why do they put it in there in the first place? Well, if you think back to 1979 when around the time they started using these clauses, when interest rates were 14% and you took over a 5% loan, of course they wanted to accelerate it to force you into a 14% loan. But if you took subject to here a loan that, let's say, was 4 or 5%, and the market rates are 4 or 5%, well, there's no reason for them to call it a loan, particularly if it was already in default and you made it current. What are they going to do? Thanks for making it current, now we're going to call it due? It's probably not going to happen. It's not to say it's never going to happen, but it's a very, very small chances. In fact, I've been doing this for years, not only myself, but for hundreds of clients, and I only had one case where the lender called it due. A seller was upset that the buyer hadn't paid off his loan, even though the buyer didn't promise to. 5 years later, he called up my client and said, "When are you paying it off?" And he, like a wise guy, said, "Never. Go away." And so the seller didn't like that, so he calls up the lender and says, he took over my loan and he refuses to pay it off. So the lender wrote a letter to my client saying, "Due on sale, you've got 30 days to pay it off." So he comes to me and says, "What do I do?" I said, "Well, 30 days is a little unreasonable. Let's ask for 6 months. That's not unreasonable. Can you sell it or refi it in 6 months?" He said, "Yeah." So I wrote a letter, "Dear bank, we got your letter. We'd like 6 months to pay it off." We don't hear anything. So he goes and sells the property. 6 months later, we get a letter back. You know what the answer was? No. That's the intelligent life form we're dealing with when we're dealing with banks. So the odds are probably not going to happen, and more than likely, what if they do call it due? Well, you can try to assume it, you could sell it, you can refi it, you could give it back to the seller. There's lots of different options. So it's not a big risk. There are risks in real estate that are a lot more common than this one, but the risk-reward factor is so much in the favor of reward, and the risk is so small that it's a very valid strategy.